Hold on.
What's the highest you've ever jumped? For most of us, that number never exceeds more than a few feet, for the simple reason that jumping off anything higher is terrifying. Basophobia, or the fear of falling, is a phobia inherent to humans and many species of animals. In the visual cliff experiment, a vast majority of infants would not cross what appeared to them as a steep drop. The fear of falling appears to be ingrained into the very fiber of our being. It's a sensation that's mutually understood by all, but somewhat difficult to articulate. Statistically speaking, you're about 100 times more likely to die in a car accident than a plane crash, yet most of us undoubtedly find flying much more terrifying than driving. So why is this the case?
Because you don't control it and it's not even
the answer lies in the element of control. If you're driving and something goes wrong, you at least feel like you have some input over your own destiny. If something goes wrong on a plane, well, you're just along for the ride. There's a certainty to falling that's impossible to deny. Once you step over the edge, you become nothing more than an object in motion. Your status, wealth, athleticism, intellect, none of it matters at that point. You have surrendered yourself to the complete mercy of nature and the unbreakable laws that govern it. In works of fiction,
It's worse! Man, guys, people that work at Chick-fil-A, this goes to Chick-fil-A, do that on the corporate, close their doors. I don't give a fuck about the chicken, I don't give a fuck. I might eat this. Your coffee is so shit, it's an insult to any drinkables out there. This is a shit.
Great falls are used to represent finality. Characters are often allowed to cheat death in all sorts of ways, but once you fall into the bottomless pit, it's game over. There's something so absolute about its outcome. To question it would be to question one's own sanity. Only a madman would intentionally step off the platform of unfathomable heights. And yet, in the visual cliff experiment, a few infants would crawl over the cliff completely unfazed. Possibly because they had not yet developed depth perception, but perhaps they grew up to be the
I swallowed a piece of ice. I can't. I'm gonna lose my shit. I can't do it.
Billions of years of evolutionary programming to defy the most fundamental fear of man. This is the story of the world's highest jump. The jump I made here was about a meter, or around 3 feet in height. It's a jump I'm sure most of you would have no problem making as well, but how much higher could you go without hurting yourself in a basic jump like this? In Minecraft, a fall of 4 blocks or higher will make you take damage.
My biggest, I think, jump with that is like man-made. I overshot a 70-footer on snowboarding. That's deadly. It is what it is.
A fall of 23.5 blocks is fatal. In reality,
that's not
the farthest you can safely fall onto a hard surface is around 10 to 12 feet. Higher than that, and you're likely to walk away with minor injuries. When The Undertaker threw Mick Foley off the top of the cell at King of the Ring 98, Foley plummeted at least 16 feet, dislocating his shoulder in the process. A fall of 20 feet or higher will most likely result in serious injuries, and beyond 100 feet, a fall is considered unsurvivable. There's a common
Hold on.
Or higher will make you take damage. A fall of 23.5 blocks is fatal. In reality, the farthest you can safely fall onto a hard surface is around 10 to 12 feet. Higher than that, and you're likely to walk away with minor injuries. When The Undertaker threw Mick Foley off the top of the cell at King of the Ring 98, Foley plummeted at least 16 feet, dislocating his shoulder in the process. A fall of 20 feet or higher will most likely result in serious injuries, and beyond 100 feet, a fall is considered unsurvivable. There's a common misconception that landing in water will break your fall, but due to surface tension, the only thing you'll be breaking is most of your bones. Landing in water from 100 feet is equivalent to landing on concrete. Surviving any fall greater than that is exceedingly...
Dude, there's a bunch of like intangibles of water and shit like that you can make me survive it.
rare without protective equipment.
It's
but for
true.
the vast majority of human history, all people had to brace themselves were their arms and legs.
With other
Naturally,
components,
this meant that any early attempts at the world's highest jump were almost certainly done so involuntarily. The first unsung record holders of this category may have earned their title by accident, by force, or by a failed attempt to end their life. But if someone in prehistoric times did want to make the jump of a lifetime, how far could they possibly fall? Well, in the age before aircraft, all people had to lift themselves was the terrain of the Earth itself. Mount Everest is the tallest point on Earth, but its slope would prematurely stop you long before you reach the bottom. For a continuous, uninterrupted fall, you would have to jump from the world's tallest cliff. For a purely vertical drop, Mount Thor in Canada has a prominence of over 4,100 feet. While highly unlikely, it's theoretically possible that somebody could have jumped from this height. However, in an age before written history, no.
Yeah, but because of the horizontal, you wouldn't make it that far up, back down. It would probably end like over here, probably, right?
One can say for sure. For the first recording of anyone jumping off anything, we have to venture closer to the stone mountains of China.
Horizontal.
As far as we know, this event may have never happened. The only information on it was written by a guy 2,000 years before our time, about a guy 2,000 years before his time. As the legend goes, Emperor Shun escaped the roof of a burning barn by gliding off using his hat to slow his descent.
Oh,
By
please.
my estimate, the jump was probably done from the equivalent of a 2-story building, or about 20 feet. It may not sound like much, but this was significant. It's the earliest recorded instance of anyone jumping with intent, rather than falling by mistake. All future jumps would be successors to Shun's 20-foot leap off the burning barn. The ancient Chinese were one of the first civilizations to experiment with aeronautics. As early as 200 BC, acrobats would use bamboo shoots to perform falling stunts at the imperial palace. By 500 AD, kites had become commonplace in Chinese society. Some kite designs had become aerodynamic enough to support the weight of a man. In 559, Yuan Huangtou was one of several prisoners ordered to be executed by gliding off the 108-foot tall Phoenix Tower. Remarkably, Yuan survived, claiming the unofficial jump record in the process. For his achievement, Yuan was executed anyway. Despite his grim fate, the record would remain alive for more than 1,000 years. The next great leap in aeronautical innovation came during the Italian Renaissance. Leonardo da Vinci is often credited with the invention of the parachute, but an even earlier concept can be traced back to 1470 from an anonymous manuscript. In 1615, Fausto Veranzio improved upon Leonardo's design, but so far, the parachute only existed in concept. It wasn't until the 18th century that the parachute was brought into reality. Louis Sebastian Lenormand would design and manufacture the first modern parachute. On December 26, 1783, Lenormand would record the first parachute jump in history by jumping from the upper balcony of the Montpellier Observatory. That very same year, just 120 miles away in Annonay, the Montgolfier brothers would develop the first hot air balloon. Within the span of a few months, mankind had not only broken free from Earth's terrain, but found a way to weaken the grip of gravity itself. And it was only a matter of time before someone would use both to make history. On October 22, 1797, André Garnerin became the first person to parachute out of an aircraft. Garnerin rose to 3,200 feet in a hot air balloon, then severed the basket, parachuting back down unharmed. You could argue that this wasn't a true jump, as Garnerin never actually stepped out of the balloon's basket.
Yeah.
But based on the illustrations of the basket's design, I would say that it serves little purpose in actually protecting the user, and rather functions as a necessary component of the parachute itself. The important thing is that André Garnerin flew about 500 feet higher than the top of the Burj Khalifa, then severed his only means of flotation, placing full faith in the thin fabric above his head to ensure that he didn't wind up becoming a human crepe. On that day in 1797, André Garnerin became the first skydiver. Just 5 years later, he would set a new all-time record, jumping from a height of 8,000 feet. Garnerin's aerial heroics would inspire a new generation of daredevils who would replicate his death-defying stunt in front of spectators around the world. 19th century parachuters would draw crowds at local carnivals and other venues by dropping out of the sky from altitudes of 2,000 to 5,000 feet. This range is comparable to the cruising altitude of the Fortnite battle bus, and while the stunts look death-defying, sometimes death would not be defied. In 1837, Robert Cocking earned the grim distinction of becoming the first skydiving fatality after his parachute failed at 5,000 feet. Cocking was supposedly attempting to reach the 8,000-foot mark that Garnerin had set decades prior, but the record would not be undone. News of Cocking's death was a sobering reminder to the dangers of falling from thousands of feet in the air, and it extinguished the popularity of parachuting for decades afterwards. For the rest of the 1800s, there were no jump attempts on record surpassing Garnerin's 8,000-foot mark. This was mostly due to the limitations of parachutes, as balloons continued to soar throughout the 19th century. Since would-be jumpers were no longer encumbered by the Earth's terrain, the highest theoretical jump was now determined by the balloon altitude record. Even at this time, unmanned balloons could easily rise to tens of thousands of feet, but manned flights now had to deal with the limits of human physiology. Above 15,000 feet, most people will begin to suffer the effects of oxygen deprivation. Most modern-day skydiving excursions will not fly above this altitude for that very reason. Above 26,000 feet is the death zone, the limit beyond which the human body can no longer survive without supplemental oxygen. In 1862, James Glacier and Henry Coxwell became the first people to surpass the death zone. At around 29,000 feet, the pair lost consciousness, with Coxwell barely managing to pull the balloon's valve cord before blacking out. The pair survived when the balloon rapidly descended back to a safe height, but not before setting a new altitude record estimated between 29,000 and 37,000 feet. By 1887, oxygen tanks became commercially available, allowing ballooners to safely enter the death zone. In 1901, Arthur Burson and Reinhard Suring set an official record of 35,000 feet in a hydrogen balloon, this time remaining conscious to record it. In 1927, Hawthorne Gray became the first person to pass the 40,000-foot mark, but perished after running out of oxygen. In 1931, Auguste Piccard and Paul Kupfer passed the 50,000-foot mark, becoming the first people to enter the stratosphere, as well as the first people to truly witness the curvature of the Earth. In 1933, at the Century of Progress World Fair, Thomas Settle and Chester Fordney would surpass 60,000 feet. By this point, record attempts were quickly approaching the next hard limit in manned balloon flights.
Space!
As altitude increases, air pressure decreases, as does the boiling point of fluids. At around 60,000 feet, air pressure is low enough where the temperature of your body will exceed the boiling point of water, causing your blood to literally boil. This limit is otherwise known as the Armstrong line, and future flights above it will require a pressurized suit. In 1934, the Soviet Union's Osa Vyakhin 1 surpassed the Armstrong line and reached a peak altitude of 72,000 feet, before the balloon disintegrated during its descent, killing all 3 crew members. 1 year later, in what would be a precursor to the space race, the United States took back the record when Albert Stevens and Orville Anderson reached 72,400 feet in the Explorer 2 craft. By this point, balloon flight progression had provided the jump record with massive potential for improvement, but before anyone could attempt a new record, the parachute would have to rise to the occasion. The turn of the 20th century saw 2 tremendous strides in aeronautics, with the invention of the airplane and the airship. The unprecedented boom in air travel renewed interest in the parachute. In 1907, aerial stuntman Charles Broadwick would provide the first major parachute innovation with a static line, which allowed the chute to automatically deploy when jumping out of an aircraft. In 1914, Broadwick's adopted daughter Tiny became the first person to manually deploy a chute while in freefall, eventually leading to the invention of the ripcord. And starting in 1919, Leslie Irvin began manufacturing and distributing the Type A parachute for use as life preservers on airplanes. The Irvin chute would revitalize the pastime of stunt jumping. Just as the balloon jumpers would perform death-defying jumps a century earlier, a new generation of aerial acrobats would wow spectators by jumping from the cockpits of their airplanes. This new wave of daredevils became known as the Barnstormers, the most famous of which was a man by the name of Charles Lindbergh. Lindbergh was most known for making the first non-stop transatlantic flight, but buried among his long list of aviation accomplishments was the new record for the world's highest jump. In 1926, Lindbergh used an Irvin chute to bail out of his plane at an altitude of 13,000 feet, finally breaking Garnerin's record after more than a century. 1927 saw the first tests of parachutes in military combat, leading to the rise of the paratrooper. In 1943, U.S. Army surgeon Randy Lovelace became the first person on record to jump from the stratosphere. In an Air Force experiment, Lovelace bailed out of an Army bomber at over 40,000 feet. The force of the parachute knocked him unconscious, and the minus 40-degree temperatures left his hands frostbitten. But Lovelace survived the jump by the skin of his teeth, claiming the record in the process. The first ever jump
like
from the
3x.
stratosphere would be the last with a conventional parachute, at least in the United States. Soviet jumpers Vasily Romanyuk and Nikolai Nikitin would both set higher marks, with Nikitin surpassing 47,000 feet in 1957. While the Russians were fixated on the record itself, the US directed their focus to survival. If pilots were to survive ejecting at very high altitudes, they would need to be equipped with parachutes fit for the edge of space. Randy Lovelace's near-fatal jump would usher in a new era, the dawn of the space jump.
I'm going to jump!
Oh! Do a flip!
Yes.com/. Scientifically speaking, outer space doesn't begin until the Kármán line, more than 300,000 feet high. The region between it and the Armstrong line is classified as near space, and as jet planes flew higher, pilots would need a new kind of parachute to safely eject from this range. Following Randy Lovelace's near-fatal jump, the Air Force began testing experimental high-altitude parachutes on dummies. Early designs would force the dummies into an uncontrollable flat spin that would be potentially fatal on human subjects. By 1958, they were ready to test out a new multi-stage design that was intended to stabilize the jumper. Only this time, the test would be conducted on a human being, an unenviable task bestowed upon Captain Joseph Kittinger. Kittinger had already proven himself as the Air Force's new favorite guinea pig with his role in Project Manhigh, a 1957 research assignment that saw Kittinger soar 96,000 feet in a balloon, setting a new altitude record in the process. His next assignment would be Project Excelsior, where Kittinger would once again rise to the stratosphere in a balloon, only this time he would have to jump out. On November 16, 1959, Kittinger fastened his pressure suit and boarded Excelsior 1, rising to an altitude of 76,400 feet. At that point, Kittinger unstrapped himself from the gondola and stepped over the edge. Immediately, there was a problem. Kittinger had prematurely deployed his stabilization chute. Just like the test dummies, Kittinger entered an uncontrollable spin. At 120 RPM, Kittinger blacked out nearly 13 miles above the Earth. He regained consciousness just 3,000 feet from the ground. Miraculously, the rest of the chutes functioned according to plan, allowing Joe Kittinger to escape with his life and a new record. Despite a near disaster on the first run, Kittinger was determined to prove that the new parachute system could work. Less than a month later, Kittinger would return to the skies with Excelsior 2, jumping from 74,000 feet. This time, the parachutes functioned flawlessly, and although he was just shy of adding to the record, he would get one more chance to make history in the summer of 1960. On the morning of August 16th, Kittinger boarded the gondola for Excelsior 3. Sudden cloud cover almost canceled the mission before it started, but Kittinger launched just 1 minute before the orders to cancel the flight. Soon after, overcast skies would be the least of his concerns. At about 50,000 feet, Kittinger realized that his right glove had failed to pressurize, causing his hand to swell to twice its size. Despite the potentially catastrophic complication, Kittinger did not inform the ground crew. He knew that if he did, the mission would be immediately aborted. Anticipating that they would never get another chance at a jump, Kittinger bit the bullet and continued to rise. About 1 hour and 40 minutes after launch, Kittinger took the highest step in the world and jumped from the stratosphere for the final time. Kittinger free-fell for 4.5 minutes before deploying his main chute. He reached a top speed of 614 miles per hour. 13 minutes and 45 seconds after stepping out of the gondola, Joe Kittinger touched down in the New Mexico desert. The ground crew was ecstatic. Not only was Excelsior 3 a resounding success, but Kittinger had just landed from the highest jump in history. So just how high did Joe go?
this guy.
102,800 feet. Not only did Joe Kittinger set the all-time jump record, he did so while setting the all-time balloon altitude record, the second highest altitude ever reached by man at that point. After proving that humans
So
could survive
close.
exposure to the upper atmosphere, Project Excelsior would open the floodgates for manned space exploration. Soon after, both the US and Soviet Union would send the first astronauts into orbit. But in that moment, Kittinger stood farther from the Earth's surface than all but a single person before him, and then jumped back down. Years later, while serving in Vietnam, Kittinger would be captured as a prisoner of war after his plane was shot down. One has to wonder which moment was more terrifying. Remarkably, despite accomplishing one of the most impressive feats in the history of aviation, Kittinger never actually cared about the record. He took far more satisfaction in completing the mission and validating the effectiveness of the high-altitude parachute. Ironically, the record would go on to define his legacy. Before Joe Kittinger, the jump record only existed as a formality, a sloppy and poorly documented patchwork of events consisting mostly of people who stumbled into the record completely unintentionally. In many ways, Kittinger was no different, but after Excelsior, the record would never be the same. It was the first time that the world's highest jump was documented, broadcasted, and celebrated in the media. Kittinger had effectively made the record tangible, and before long, a new wave of contenders were lining up to break it.
Really?
Naturally, the first people to challenge for the American record were the Russians. In 1962, Pyotr Dolgov and Yevgeny Andreev were tasked with the Soviet Union's first attempt at a space jump. Andreev successfully jumped from 83,000 feet, setting a new record for the longest free fall. Dolgov jumped from nearly 94,000 feet, but perished after his suit depressurized. Dolgov's death would be covered up for years, but as far as the Soviets were concerned, the mission was a success. Even though Joe Kittinger's record was well documented and precisely measured with state-of-the-art technology, it wasn't verified by the FAI, allowing the Soviets to claim the official record despite falling nearly 20,000 feet short. For all intents and purposes, Joe Kittinger still held the record, but the Soviets had the validation of a bureaucratic sanctioning body in Switzerland, and they were content with that. Not content with the disputed title was a young adventurer from New Jersey, Nicholas Piantanida.
New Jersey, of course.
The young skydiver had been obsessed with jumping ever since his childhood, where he would nearly fall to his death after jumping from the roof of his apartment with a makeshift parachute made from his bedsheets. By the 60s, Piantanida was determined to bring the undisputed record back to America by making the greatest jump in history. His goal was to break both Kittinger's altitude record and Andreev's freefall record in what would become known as Project Strato Jump. But unlike the space jumpers before him, Piantanida didn't have government backing. He had to essentially create his own ragtag aeronautical research program from scratch, using sponsors, volunteers, and borrowed facilities. While preparing for the jump, Piantanida sought out consultation from Joe Kittinger himself. Kittinger, never a fan of chasing records, refused. He had nearly lost his life performing the feat just a few years prior, and he didn't appreciate Piantanida's cavalier attitude towards the daunting challenge. However, despite his bare-bones resources, Piantanida and the Strato team managed to assemble a working balloon, gondola, and pressure suit. By the autumn of 1965, Nick Piantanida was ready to take to the skies. On October 22nd, Strato Jump 1 lifted off from a field outside of St. Paul, Minnesota. Unfortunately, high wind shear would destroy the balloon at just 16,000 feet, forcing an emergency landing and a second attempt. He would try again on February 2nd, 1966. This time, the balloon had no problem reaching the stratosphere, where it continued rising. Soon, it had soared past Andreev's mark of 80,000, then past Kittinger's mark of 102,000. Piantanida's balloon topped out at an unprecedented height of 123,500 feet. His unyielding hubris was about to pay off. The record was tantalizingly close. All Nick Piantanida had to do was step out of the gondola and into the record books.
He was 8 the whole time.
But there was a problem. The oxygen line tethering Piantanida to the gondola wouldn't detach, and he had no way of severing the connection. After several agonizing minutes at the edge of glory, the ground crew decided to abort the mission. In a turbulent and dangerous descent, a battered Piantanida returned to Earth with the gondola. After the heartbreaking failure, Piantanida would not be deterred. On May 1st, 1966, he stepped back into the gondola with the goal of once again reaching the 120,000 foot mark. This time, he would pay the ultimate price. At 57,000 feet, Nick Piantanida's suit depressurized. The ground crew immediately aborted the mission, but at that point, very little could be done. Piantanida was starved of oxygen for more than 20 minutes, falling into a coma from which he never recovered. As close as he came to proving everyone wrong, Piantanida's recklessness would ultimately cost him everything. He met a cruelly fitting fate, spending his final moments in the sky, the place he always seemed to belong. The Stratojump catastrophe would mark the end of record attempts for a while. Neither of the two world superpowers were interested in balloon jump escapades anymore.
Are you fucking kidding me?
They had moved on to new frontiers. Future record holders would have to independently direct their own operations. After progressing through millennia of physical barriers to the sky, the newest limitations to the jump record were now cost and ambition. The 60s had quickly become the age of the astronaut, and the boom in space exploration had taken much of the luster off the once vaunted space jump. It seemed that the only notable jumps of this era happened by complete chance. In 1966, American pilot Bill Weaver would survive a 78,000-foot fall after ejecting from a jet at Mach 3. His life would be spared thanks to the same parachute design that Joe Kittinger had tested just 6 years prior. In 1971, D.B. Cooper became the first and only person to successfully commit airplane piracy, parachuting an estimated 10,000 feet with $200,000 in ransom money. In 1973, Serbian flight attendant Venca Vulovic survived the highest fall on record without a parachute after the plane she was servicing exploded at 33,000 feet. And in 1982, Larry Walters survived an ascent to 16,000 feet after tying dozens of weather balloons to a lawn chair. The next attempt at the world's highest jump wouldn't happen until the 90s, with decorated British paratrooper Nish Bruce. Starting in the early 90s, Bruce began training for the eventual Skydive from Space project, where he would make...
Chat, how did you even live it? Like that fall with the parachute? It's just like some bullshit, like intangible, like coincidences, a bunch of random shit, no?
A planned jump from 130,000 feet. The project was partially funded by NASA, who wanted to test the effects of radiation at high altitudes. Despite an encouraging start, the project would abruptly end in 1994 when Bruce suffered an unexpected mental breakdown, stabbing his girlfriend with a pair of scissors. The incident would mark the beginning of Bruce's 8-year-long battle with mental illness, a battle he would eventually lose. In 2002, Nish Bruce would end his life by intentionally jumping from a plane without a parachute. Much like Nick Piantanida, Nish Bruce was someone who seemed to belong to the sky, this time going out on his own terms. After 4 decades of magnificent failure since Project Excelsior, the new millennium would bring a new wave of contenders trying to beat the record. Starting in 2000, Cheryl Stearns would announce her plans to jump from 130,000 feet with the formation of the StratoQuest project. Stearns was the most accomplished female skydiver in history and was prepared to make the ultimate jump in the spring of 2001. Unfortunately, StratoQuest could never quite materialize. After numerous delays and funding issues, the project had fallen defunct by the end of the 2000s.
An Australian man, Rod Milner, announced that next March he plans to skydive from 25 miles above the Earth, reaching speeds over 1,000 miles an hour and breaking the sound barrier.
In 2001, Australian skydiver Rod Milner would make waves in the media by announcing his plan to jump from 130,000 feet and break the sound barrier with his fall. The mission, titled Project Space Jump, had reportedly secured funding from the Australian Defence Force Academy, with plans to launch a year later in March 2002. Well, a year came and went, and no jump was ever attempted. Following the initial media hype, Project Space Jump was never discussed again and eventually forgotten, coming off much more like a publicity stunt than an actual attempt at the record. In 2003, French adventurer Michel Fournier announced Le Grand Saut, during which he planned to jump from 130,000 feet. Fournier made the most progress of anyone in the decade, managing to produce a working balloon, pressure suit, and gondola. Unfortunately, all of Fournier's attempts would be aborted before they could even launch. After spending 2 decades and nearly $20 million chasing the record, Michel Fournier couldn't even get off the ground. 2010 would mark the 50-year anniversary of Joe Kittinger's record, and after half a century of failure, many began to wonder whether anyone could break it. Starting in 2010, Red Bull would sponsor the Stratos project and team up with Austrian skydiver Felix Baumgartner to finally top Kittinger's record once and for all. Preparing Felix for the jump would be none other than Joe Kittinger himself. Kittinger's blessings seemed to ward off the demons that had plagued all other attempts since he set the record. In March 2012, Baumgartner would successfully complete the project's first test jump from 71,000 feet. In July, he would complete the second test jump, this time from 96,000 feet. And finally, on October 14, 2012, Felix Baumgartner was ready to make history in a moment streamed live around the world.
Speed 650 miles per hour. Showing Felix a stable descent.
There's the chute. There's the chute. There you can see by the approaching shot. It's just about there. And he's down on the
After finally having his record broken, Joe Kittinger never looked happier. After 52 years of frustration, there was finally a new record holder of the world's highest jump. In addition to setting the altitude record, Felix Baumgartner became the first jumper in history to break the sound barrier in his freefall, as well as setting the record for the longest distance in freefall. The YouTube livestream was watched by nearly 10 million viewers, a record that itself would stand for almost 6 years. The new record provided a rare moment of inspiration for a generation who had very little to celebrate in terms of aeronautical achievement. Truly, it was a jump for the ages. After taking half a century to beat Kittinger's mark of 102,000, who knew how long it would take to beat Baumgartner? The record would stand for 2 years. On October 24, 2014, computer scientist Alan Eustace would set a new altitude record of 135,889 feet. Eustace worked as the senior VP of engineering at Google and had no prior history of skydiving or extreme stunts. One day he decided that he wanted to pursue the record, so he assembled a team of collaborators to form StratX. Eustace became the first jumper in history to ascend to the stratosphere without a gondola, relying only on a pressure suit to protect him from the vacuum of near space. The reduction in weight allowed him to soar more than 8,000 feet higher than Baumgartner's mark. In just a single attempt at the record,
they made autopilot like this.
Pressure suit to protect him from the vacuum of near space. The reduction in weight allowed him to soar more than 8,000 feet higher than Baumgartner's mark. In just a single attempt at the record, Alan Eustace went up and got it. That's where the record stands today, but where does it go from here? Well, the record for the highest unmanned balloon flight is 173,900 feet. Lighter weight missions like StratX may approach this altitude, but sooner or later, jumpers will reach another hard limit, the mesosphere. Starting at around 170,000 feet, the air becomes thin enough to force any balloon to burst from the pressure difference. As a result, the mesosphere is the least explored part of the atmosphere, extending too high for balloons and too low for satellites.
So
but what if you were to skip the mesosphere entirely and jump from a satellite? The International Space Station orbits in the thermosphere at an average altitude of about 1.3 million feet, nearly 10 times the height of the current record. However, since the ISS is in orbit, it's traveling about 10 times faster than an average bullet. Re-entering the atmosphere at that speed will cause the human body to burn up like a meteor. Currently, the best hope for space jumps beyond the stratosphere may be Virgin Galactic's Spaceship Two, a suborbital spaceplane capable of surpassing the 300,000-foot mark. Due to the parabolic shape of the flight path, it could be theoretically possible to jump from the peak without extreme exit velocity. Virgin Galactic plans to launch commercial flights on the spaceplane starting this decade, so it's possible that the next great stride in space jumping may be just a few years away. For now, the record stands at just under 136,000 feet. No matter the era, death-defying jumps have never failed to amaze and inspire those who witness them. Space jumping is both a product and an example of our endless thirst for progress. 60 years ago, as Joe Kittinger gazed down at the Earth prior to his record-setting jump, he remarked at the irony of such beauty existing in such deadly conditions. He compared floating through the stratosphere to being enveloped in an ocean of cyanide. Despite literally being on top of the world, Kittinger was overcome with an overwhelming sense of humility. We defy nature by venturing higher and higher, and nature humbles us with its unconquerable vastness. After 4,000 years of trying, we have already managed to jump from unfathomable heights, but we still have so much farther to go. For the future of the world's highest jump, the sky's the limit.
Chat. Chat. What if you build a stick that reaches into space? Like, where is it going? Chat, you know, because of the gravity and all, and orbiting, chat, if you think about it, chat, right? There's the Earth, right? And this is the orbit. If you build a thing like this, it's gonna want to orbit, no? Try to balance it. Well, all you have to do is make it bigger than it. Like, realistically, if you really think about it, you could do that if you make it thick enough. Oh no, because it would be too heavy.